Well, welcome to Massey College and to this, what I think is the second panel session on ethics here this fall. And as we begin, I would like to do the land acknowledgement. Massey College is built on land where many Indigenous peoples have lived. It's on the treaty lands of the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, as well as the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and Haudenosaunee peoples. We want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward the land and the great privilege that we have to work on this land. Well, today's topic is on travel. And Tom Axworthy and I were together in the summertime, and we were planning these series of ethics panels. And we began to talk about how everybody is returning to travel. And we thought, let's do one on travel. And I have to admit that initially our idea was that we would look at the big picture question. We would talk about the airlines and the airport authorities and how badly all that was going. I mean, it's almost become a national pastime, right, to talk critically about the airline industry and the airports. And so that's where the road we started. And then we shifted. And we said, no, let's take a little different tact. We've, in these sessions, we've tackled things recently like artificial intelligence. We've looked at codes of conduct for government officials, kind of bigger picture. And we said, let's put this at a more personal level and look at the issue of personal responsibility, personal ethics in terms of travel. And so as we look at that today, I'm reminded of a lot of philosophers who speak about moral responsibility. And Plato talked about three elements within moral responsibility. One was knowledge, the other was desire or intent, and the other one was right action. And I think those are reasonably good kind of focus for us in our conversation today. And so I look forward to that. My own background in travel is obviously, like many of you, I've done lots of personal travel, but I've also, over the last 35 years or so, at least every second year, taken groups of people on tours into the Middle East and into Syria, obviously before the Civil War, Lebanon, dipped our feet into the north of Iraq, Jordan, Palestine, Israel. Obviously, we go to do a little bit of pleasure, but also to learn history and culture, and also to look at some of the difficult issues within the region. So I've had a fair bit of experience with that kind of travel as well. But we have this morning, or I guess it's now afternoon, it's noon hour, with us two people. Our third panelist couldn't join us, and I'm disappointed. Madeline was going to join us, and she's a junior fellow here, and I was really looking forward to her being able to talk with us because she does a lot of travel as part of her academic research, and I thought in an academic setting that would have been a very interesting kind of conversation. But we wish her well because she's not been feeling well over the last number of days. But I want to introduce our panel. Emily Tsui is a University of Toronto grad, a lawyer, an associate with Paul Weiss, Rifkind, Wharton, and Garrison. We talk about people having the travel bug, and this is the ultimate travel bug. Did you tell me, I think in a note that you've been to 50 different countries? About, yeah. So we obviously look forward to hearing about that, and I'm intrigued, and also understand you made a long hiking journey from somewhere in South America all the way up to the Alaska. Is that what you did?
That's right. We hitchhiked from Argentina at the very bottom to the top of Alaska over 6 months.
Wow, fantastic. That's the travel bug. And we have Stuart MacDonald. Stuart is a business advisor and investor, a focus on online and web-enabled businesses. He is also the founder of Expedia.ca, and interesting to note that he began that in his house. So when I first met Stuart, and you won't even remember this, but we met for coffee. And I was asking about what you do, and you were talking about your business consultancy, and I asked you, what your background was that brought you to that. And you said to me, I don't remember this, I laughed so hard, you said, well, you might have heard about it. He said, maybe not. And I said, well, what? He said, Expedia. And I said, Stuart, yeah, I think I've heard about it. But also, he was the chief marketing officer for Expedia.com in Seattle for a number of years. And currently, just of interest as well, he's with CIRA, which is the Canadian Registration Authority, which has oversight, a government appointment of the .ca domain. So a very interesting background Stuart will bring to us. And I'm going to turn this over to Emily and let you share with us some of your observations about travel and about this whole dimension of kind of personal choice and ethical kind of reality. So thank you.
Thanks, Don. I think first I'd just like to say that I am a lawyer by training and I practice as a lawyer, but at heart I am a traveler. And I go out I max out my vacation days to travel because I think travel is extremely important to me and is extremely important to a lot of people who have the great fortune to be able to travel. And I think that's where I'd like to start, is that I think travel is a huge privilege, but it's also an immense responsibility, especially as a Canadian who is doing well, much better off than a lot of the world. And so the choices that we make and where we spend our money when we travel abroad is extremely important. I think that goes back to something that you said, Dawn, about Plato, is that when we travel, I think we have the responsibility to educate ourselves before we go abroad. And before we do that, I try to read as many books as possible about the places that I'm going, and I really try to look at it from a critical perspective as well. So before I went to South America, I read The Open Veins of Latin America, which is a book about American imperialism in South America, so that you have a better understanding about what the history is there and why we can go to South America largely without a visa, without any problems, and whereas the same people coming to Canada has a lot of problems trying to get in. And the process of them applying to get visas in Canada is a lot more difficult than for us to just pay money and go visit South America. I think that when it comes to traveling and boycotting, I think in an email you asked me to talk about that. I don't think that boycotting entire countries is the right move to do, unless in very specific cases where, for example, when you travel to Myanmar, for example, at a certain time, all the hotels were owned by the military. So you know that your money when you're spent there was going to support what the military was doing in Myanmar. But overwhelmingly the cases when you travel and the choices you make, it can be a really great force for good. It's that you can make sure that your money is going to the local people, and when you choose the places you stay, you can do the research behind it. You can stay at the small hostels. You can make sure that you take public transportation. You don't need to take a private car. But even if you take a private car, you're still helping the person who's driving. So in any case, I think travel is a huge force for good. I think everyone should travel if they can, and if they couldn't, what I'd like to see personally is the government giving every young person like $5,000 and say, go travel, go to a different country and have fun. And I was greatly fortunate to be able to travel for 6 months, hitchhiking mostly, and seeing all the people that I've met in Central America. And before I went to Central America, I thought Honduras is this great scary place. You always hear about how dangerous it is in the news, but then you go there and you're like, wait a minute, everyone there is so nice. Everyone will pick you up in the back of their truck and drive you to wherever you need to go if you're just hitchhiking. And it's really, really nice to see that everyone is so friendly. And I think that travel is just a force for good. But I think you have the responsibility in all the choices that you make while you're traveling to follow your own personal ethical compass, I think, as well. And so to make sure that the hotels you're staying at are, they're not run by the military, for example. If you choose to go swim with the sea turtles, you want to make sure that's not done in like a large boat that will disrupt the breeding habitats of the sea turtles. And I think, Dawn, that hopefully that's like a start to the conversation here.
I'm intrigued by your starting, which was exactly where I do too, which is educating yourself. and learning as much as you can. And I think that's really an important factor. One of the places I've been a lot over the years is Turkey. And I'm going to tell you that Turkish guides, whether you take them for a day or for on a tour, are probably the best anywhere I've ever experienced. The amount of knowledge and training they have is just incredible. They are, though, trained by the state. And so you have to ask, whose story are they telling, you know? And so that I appreciate that comment about educating, because it's a good thing to know well in advance what's going on and where the sensitive spots are. So that's helpful. Stuart could share any number of things with us.
Well, thanks, Don. I mean, when just the topic itself, the ethics of travel, my goodness, that's just loaded in multiple ways. And I'm going to start with the first question is, I bet when everybody here and online hears travel, it means something different to them. People are thinking about different things when they think about travel. But most travel is going to visit friends and family. Most travel is going to reconnect with loved ones. Most travel involves going to spend time and money and share a meal with people that we care about. The next big thing is people traveling for business and trade. So going abroad, going to other cities, to develop business relationships, to create trading environments that ultimately result in people potentially having jobs, to be able to build things, going to conferences, meeting lots of people, creating these sorts of bonds. So, when we talk about travel, we're talking about a thing that is very, very big and has multiple definitions. And it's easy to sort of think about, well, what are the right decisions when it comes to travel from an ethical perspective, and try to sort of put that in a context. But when you have to think about it in terms of everything that travel means, right? So travel means the things that I just said. Most of it is visiting friends and relatives, then is traveling for business purposes or trade purposes. Then, it's experiencing another culture. It's learning another place. It's also relaxation. It's recharging. It's getting away from the snow. It's all of these things that matter to people, and all of them come with their own sorts of complexities and their own sorts of decisions and thought processes when you're thinking about it. The idea that maybe there's a right decision or a wrong decision, it really isn't that black or white when it comes to travel. Things are all about shades of gray. There are some things that you can do that are better choices. There are some things that you can do that might be worse choices, but it isn't like by doing this thing, you've solved all the problems. There are multiple things that are happening at any given moment, and you can't just do one thing and say that it's done. The other thing to remember is that travel and tourism on a global basis employs more people than any other category. Around the world in 2019, before COVID hit, 330 million people worked in travel and tourism. 10% of the employed population on the planet works in travel and tourism. So when we think about ethical choices and we think about what's the right thing to do and how do we direct our dollar and our time and what is it that we do and what don't we do, we're also indirectly and very directly impacting the lives and livelihood of tens and hundreds of millions of people. And through the COVID crisis, we saw that number collapse. We saw more than 200 million people lose their jobs around the world. And at this point, coming into 2022, we still have more than 100 million people that have not returned to the workforce in travel and hospitality and tourism, broadly speaking. So it's a very, very nuanced question. It's not just by saying, I'm going to offset my flight with a carbon credit, therefore everything is good. It's much more nuanced than that, because travel is a force for good in many, many ways, not just in terms of personal understanding and cultural understanding and education, but also recharging, connecting with friends and loved ones, and frankly, the employment and livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people around the world.
Stuart, we were talking before, and I found it quite interesting, and you were talking about kind of the early stages of this kind of mass travel industry.
Yeah.
And I think it would be very interesting for people who are listening just to hear briefly the little synopsis you gave me just before we began. I was intrigued.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about travel, and in this context, I'm thinking about kind of mass travel, right? So lots and lots of people going to places, right? As opposed to back in the way back when, it was a major, major trip. You know, people would emigrate from Europe to North America, and they'd get on a ship, and they thought they would never, ever go home. They thought that was it. They thought they were done, right? The first packaged vacation, the first idea of going in a group off somewhere, was founded by Mr. Thomas Cook. There was actually a Thomas Cook, and he was the first guy to sort of organize these group tours. And these group tours first started going from one part of the UK to another part of the UK as a small group. And they would go off, and this was a thing. People didn't make these sorts of trips. They would go off and they would experience whatever. And then he started running trips to Paris. And so he would take groups of people from the UK, and they would go off to Paris in a group. But what was actually happening here was the creation of a, let's call it, prepaid package tour. Somebody would pay the amount of money, and Mr. Cook and his team would take care of everything, and you would go on the bus and then on the boat, and then you would make your way, and you would go and you would look at the cathedrals, and you do this and you do that. And that was the creation of the packaged vacation. Mass market packaged vacations became a thing really coming out of the 60s and into the 70s. And it was driven primarily, many things were driven by regulatory environments, and also, just like technology has always driven change, technology also drove change in the travel industry before there was a travel industry. Again, this started in the UK predominantly, and it came along with the normalization of travel by air. So travel by air was something that was extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily expensive. And, you know, small planes, multiple stops, very, very expensive. Typically, airlines were owned by governments. There were bilateral agreements. Everything was very, very buttoned up and very, very expensive. And what happened at that time was the government of Spain saw the opportunity to try and they were, Spain at the time was under Franco. It was it was not a well economically developed place, and they saw the opportunity to kind of harvest the bounty that they had with beautiful beaches in the south of Spain to try and create a destination. And so at that time, the creation of the first package tours that would take people by plane to the south of Spain from the UK began. And a charter carrier called Britannia was created in that time, and against first it was all kind of stopped for a while because the government-owned airline wanted to charge really high rates for people to fly, but that's where the idea of a charter flight came from. Because what a charter flight did was you left from the UK with people from the UK, you brought them to Spain, and then you brought them back. They weren't competing against the local, the local carriers. It was all sort of one thing. It was and they were able to do that off to the side, and basically the idea of a vacation package with a flight and a vacation on a beach to recharge and enjoy was born. And so that was really kind of coming out of the 60s and into the 70s. And the other and that was driven by regulatory as well as technological change. The other massive technological change that caused international travel to become available to almost anybody. Again, thinking where it used to be extremely expensive, it was all very structured, pricing was typically set, there wasn't a lot of competition, there were lots of rules and regulations. Suddenly the Boeing 747 comes into existence. The Boeing 747 allowed hundreds and hundreds of people to travel very long distances, and that simply hadn't been possible before. And so the emergence of the 747, just like more bandwidth has made more technology possible, the bandwidth in travel was the emergence of the 747, which enabled people to travel very long distances, and a lot of them in a plane. And that was able to reduce the cost. You also had the emergence of other carriers who started to fly people long distances things like Laker, things like Wardair, the emergence of these sorts of long-haul carriers using bigger aircraft to try and mass market the idea of international long-haul travel, long-haul being going a very long distance, typically over an ocean. And so then we end up in the mid-70s coming into the 80s with this idea that you can pay one price for a vacation that includes everything and go off somewhere and have that time and recharge and relax and experience and know that everything's being taken care of. And also the idea that you can go almost anywhere, and although it might not be really, really cheap, it's not beyond the reach of most people.
Thank you. I'm going to shift a little bit, and I'm going to ask each of you, and I'm going to start with Emily, to identify one or two of the things that you would see that we should be ethically concerned about when we travel. I mean, particular things.
I think today it's virtually impossible to not think about the environment when you travel, and even just getting on a plane is just something that I think about. But I think here in North America it's quite difficult compared to my friends in Europe, for example, where they have excellent long-haul trains that will take you to any country in Europe for a pretty reasonable price. Whereas for us, we have to get on a plane to go basically anywhere because Via Rail only services so far in Toronto. Yeah. And I think when we talk about, and I don't think that there is like necessarily a right answer to this, because travel is so important and it does help an individual develop their own personal experiences. It does contribute to the economy. But you know, it's undeniable that airlines are bad, and in terms of their pollution and to the environment. But hopefully things will get better as technology improves. So I think that's one thing that I wrestle with when I think about traveling and where to go next, is the carbon emissions and how to offset that. And as an individual, it's very, very hard to do. So for like short trips, I try to stay locally, and for long trips, if I'm there, I try to make sure that my stay is long to reduce the amount of carbon emissions of the flight. I think another thing that I think about when I travel is I guess it's the history of the country and the West's involvement in that country. So when we go to South America especially, and we wonder, for example, why is Argentina's government not handling inflation very well, and people have a very hard time with the cost of living there? Well, it's not because of the incompetence of the government necessarily. It's because of all the I guess money that the West has flown in and basically put it in a form of loans that make it very hard for them to pay off over time. And I think that's just something as an individual traveler to keep in mind, and just to be open-minded when you visit a new country and the people that you meet, and that they're dealing with conditions way outside of their control. But I think the individual people that you meet are lovely and they're wonderful.
It's interesting you talk about it from that perspective. I juxtapose two experiences when I've been traveling. One a number of years ago, actually just on the eve of the first invasion of Iraq, and I was with a group of people in Syria, and we were in this lovely old hotel in downtown Damascus, and we had to leave to catch a flight about 4 in the morning, so the staff were there and they prepared boxed lunches for us. And when we came through the lobby, the staff in broken English said, "Canada, you're from Canada?" And we said yes, and they started to clap. And we went, "What on earth is this about?" And if you may remember, some of you, at that point in the lead up, I think Chrétien was the Prime Minister, and one of his assistants had said something not very positive about Bush in the United States, who was the president. And they were very pleased because they liked the fact that Canadians were opposed to the invasion. And so that was an experience where I come from, was kind of very positive. However, a couple summers ago, my wife and I were in Kenya. And we were there, and obviously, we had a good time. We went on a safari, but we were also there, and we spent a week in Nairobi, primarily in Kibera, which is that massive slum. It's just 1.5 million people, second largest slum in Africa. And we were there because we're involved in an AIDS orphans program, and we wanted to see the project and to meet people. And it was interesting, everywhere we went in Kenya, to talk about being a Canadian, because they weren't unwelcoming, but they saw us as Westerners, and their perception was that as Westerners, we had primarily abandoned Africa. Our foreign aid was down. The Chinese were in and being the much more gracious and benevolent people, and in their perception. And so they weren't difficult. They weren't unwelcome. But it was clear that their perception of us was quite different. So two very different experiences, and it reminded me when you were talking about knowing who we are and where we're coming and what they think about us is quite important. Stuart, what are the obstacles?
Well, I want to kind of address what both of you were just saying, the experience with Argentina, where I've been, and it's fantastic, and your experience with, Syria and Kibera and all that sort of stuff. I think it's kind of important to put on the table that the type of travel that you two are describing represents low single digits percentages of the travel that happens in the world. Probably maybe 1% of travel that happens in the run of a year is going on safari. Maybe less than 3% of travel is a cultural exploration of South America. The vast majority of travel is going to visit friends and family and traveling for business, and then going to some kind of a resort or a hotel or a RV park or something like that. That is what people do. And so when we talk about the ethics, I think we also need to recognize that for most people, that would, what the sort of depth of consideration that you guys are giving is well past what most people do when they're considering travel. Well past. And I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. I think it's something, I think that people being more aware and being broadly concerned is absolutely important. But I'm willing to bet, and I know this from having sat on this side of the glass when travelers have been doing focus groups, people will go away on a vacation, a package vacation in the winter, and they'll come back and they'll be able to tell you what happened with the food and whether the beach was nice, but they might not even be able to tell you what country they were in, and they're more concerned about where they're going to be able to go for their $1,000 for the week than whether or not they should be traveling to Cuba because of the communist regime. It doesn't hold anybody back going from Cuba because there's nice beaches and it costs $1,000 with air. So when we talk about ethics of travel, I think it's important to raise the conversation, and I think it is more important for people to be aware, but we have to understand that most people are starting from a base of just gonna go visit mom wherever she is, and that's gonna happen. And that's the bulk of travel, right? And then it's, I'm gonna go somewhere because I've got a meeting, or I wanna drive some kind of business, and I'm gonna see some partners, I'm gonna try and make something happen. That's likely going to happen, although in a post-COVID world, there's less of that now. There's more of that happening via digital means, but the need to connect person to person is still there. And the rest of it, I don't know how realistic it is for people to think ethically about whether or not they should take their kids to Disney World. If the kids want to go to Disney World, they're going to go to Disney World. They're going to find a way to go to Disney World. They're going to either fly to Disney World or they're going to drive to Disney World, but they're going to go to Disney World. And, maybe it's important to think about the good or the bad that the Walt Disney Corporation might be doing on the planet, but I really think we need to take people where they are, and most people just want to do whatever the thing is. And so trying to get people to be more thoughtful about their choices, I think is good. But then there's an infrastructure thing that can happen regardless of people's decisions, and I think that is really important. The way that things happen in destination, the way that waste is being managed, the way that regulations are being enforced, the way that carriers and fuel companies and aircraft manufacturers are looking at things like battery operated aircraft and changing fuel sources and increasing the making things better in terms of carbon to passenger ratios and all that sort of stuff. there are things that can happen regardless of people's choices that I think are happening, but that needs to be accelerate. And so because honestly, having been in this business, both corporate and leisure since the mid-90s, I find it unlikely that there's going to be a huge awakening and people are suddenly going to start thinking differently about what it is that they do. I think we should encourage that. I think we should try and get people to think about it. But what can we be doing at a system level to make it better regardless of what choices people make? Because they're going to go and visit mom and they're going to go to Disney World. It's going to happen.
Interesting. I mean, I started out by talking about how, we talked about being, our personal kind of moral choices, but you're pushing us back to a systemic kind of understanding, and that's an intriguing thought, and you've given us quite a list of things that need to be done in that area. I'm just going to, Stuart, ask you just a little bit further in line with what I'd asked a little earlier. Where are the boogeymen, so to speak, in the travel industry? Like, what are the things, if we're going to talk about it systemically, what are the things that we should be looking at?
So I'm going to talk about travel as a source for good in multiple ways, and travel as, I won't say a source for evil, but problematic things associated.
That's a good way to put it.
No, but because everything is like that, right? So 25 years ago, I went to the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, south of Cancun, in what is now the Mayan Riviera, it's referred to. And there was a small town called Playa del Carmen, and there were a couple of hotels and this beautiful, beautiful beach. And Cancun was a different thing. We could spend hours talking about Cancun and the Mexican approach to building purpose-built developments as an economic engine, and within a certain radius of being able to fly in from North America and all these things. So, but just park that for a second. So, Playa del Carmen, sleepy little fishing town, a few little hotels. Fast forward 25 years, the entire area, there's a Home Depot in Playa del Carmen. There is a 6-lane highway. It is developed up and down. Now, I use that as a specific example because you can say, oh my goodness, millions of people are going to that area every year. The damage to the environment with the construction that's happening along there, the damage to the beaches, the corruption behind the scenes, the political stuff, the drugs, all these things, it's just awful. Then I'll flip it and say, millions of people have wonderful vacations in that part of the world. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people have jobs that they wouldn't have otherwise. There is infrastructure that simply would not be there. Sewage treatment, fresh water, highways, electrical. All that is there because the demand has resulted in the need for it, and it has been built out. Now, is it wrong? Is it wrong that this is there? Well, maybe it is, but it is there, and it does employ many hundreds of thousands of people, and it has created an economic engine for a region that otherwise might not have had it. So, corruption, damage to the environment, money that doesn't go into the destination. When you buy a packaged holiday, that money doesn't go to that hotel. It goes to a management company based in the Channel Islands or Grand Cayman or whatever. And the only money that makes it into the destination is the amount that's actually required to pay for the things that need to be paid for there. But it does generate a tax base, and it does generate infrastructure, and it does allow for there to be education, and it does allow for people to have jobs and sustain their families and be able to buy homes and things that we all take for granted. So this is why it's nuanced, right? There need to be systems, and there needs to be oversight, and there needs to be the ability to ensure that things are done as well as they can be. But simply saying it shouldn't happen feels like that's also wrong.
Okay. Emily, I'm going to just ask you, Stuart's given us quite a shopping list of things that one might, first of all, Stuart, it's the first time I've ever talked about being in the 1%. I don't know, I should thank you for that, but I never thought of myself as part of that 1%. But Emily, to be serious, long list, which ones of those grab you that you'd want to be tackled? Here's a long list. You shared some of that a little bit earlier as well.
Yeah, I think first of all, just to go on the personal responsibility part and like parents taking their kids to Disneyland, I still think your parent has a responsibility is to tell your kids that the person who's serving or person who's dressed up as Mickey Mouse probably isn't getting a living wage. And I think just to like make that more public and more transparent, I guess maybe that's what I wish for the general travelers, just to have the information that they need to make the choices that align with their ethics. Is that I think there's a lack of transparency in a lot of industries, and travel is just one of the many industries that lack transparency in terms of like, if I spend $1,000 at a Sandals resort, how much of that is actually going to the person who's bringing me drinks or like the person who's taking care of my hotel room? And I think that's probably, I guess, just more information is needed. I don't know if anyone will actually flip through that information because they'll probably pick the cheapest option at the end of the day. But I think having that option and information there for the individual, for the regulators, is probably the most important to have. And I think as a personal level, like just tip your person appropriately when you're traveling abroad. I think that's something that I don't really see when I travel with some of the young Western people, is that they're like, oh, well, we already pay them that much. Why should we tip them anymore? And I think like, no, please, like your salary makes or your tip makes a huge difference to them.
I'm just going to shift a little bit to, we have a few people here. But do any of you like to share any observations or ask any questions? Sure. Yeah, please.
Hi, so I'm Noah Kahn. I'm a junior fellow here at Massey College, and my question is related to cost. So I was wondering if you think, and this question could go to anyone, does the ethics of travel always have to come at a cost? Is it always juxtaposed to a greater cost, whether it's to the individual or the company, whatever company it might be? Because I was thinking about, Stuart, as you were saying, that cost is kind of the major factor, if not relationships to people, that they're thinking about, what can I do with my $1,000? So is there a way to, I don't know, find a way around the idea that that to be ethical cost more? Is there a possibility for that?
You want to take anybody? Want?
Sure. I actually don't think that being ethical needs to cost more. I think in many ways being ethical can cost less. And again, I find us coming back to sort of, at least in my mind, I keep thinking about sort of package vacation type things. But we have to remember that travel is much more than that. Much, much more. In fact, that's a small part. And that's sort of the parts that are there, is probably the most avoidable, but it's still valuable, relaxing and recharging and having fun. The making informed choices, I'd say, is the case regardless of what it is we're buying. When we're going into a store and you're picking something up, are you thinking about where it came from? Are you thinking about how it was made? Are you thinking about the implication of the person that was in the mine to make the can that your Coke is coming in? I mean, I don't know how deep people get on these things. But when it comes to travel, if you want to make choices that are lighter on the earth and are lighter on individuals' need to provide for you, you can do those choices. I mean, there is a growing, but still very small, but growing group of accommodation and experiences that are more tied to people's homes, or small, more environmentally composed places to stay. There's also more experiences that you can do in the outdoors that don't require any of this. You can get in a canoe and you can take a tent and you can go somewhere. Like people can make their own choices. It doesn't need to be that because people want to spend the absolute least amount, it's going to drive a bad choice. You can make good choices that are still less expensive. But the reality is, if people are looking for that kind of relaxation, break, getaway, and you're starting in Canada and it's the winter, you're probably getting on a plane, and most people are not spending a whole lot of money for these sorts of vacations. And the reality is, most people, the average leisure traveler only takes one of these trips every 2 to 3 years. So they've got to save up, and they go, and it's going to cost them a meaningful amount of their money to go, and they just want to have a good experience. And so that's why I sort of think about structurally or systemically, when that person makes those choices, are we creating something that is going to deliver that in a reduced intensity way? And also in a way that is supportive of the individual community where the people are going, and helping them provide for their families and create the livelihood and the infrastructure that they need for their community to succeed.
Okay.
I think if I can jump in.
Sure, by all means, yeah.
I think at the end of the day, it's just changing preferences, and I think the most ethical form of travel is probably also the cheapest. And that you take public transport, you hitchhike. No one wants to hitchhike these days, but you hitchhike because that's, you're saving money, you're saving the environment, and you're like staying with locals. Couch surfing, awesome. I use it all the time. And it's all at the end of the day, like basically free or very, very cheap. So I think that's a very ethical way to travel, is you're meeting locals, you're not really doing too much damage to the environment, and you're making sure your dollars go to the most local places. But I know most people don't do that. But I think maybe just have the courage and the conviction to be like, no, I'm going to go hitchhiking. I'm going to go to like another country, stay with the locals. I think that's the way to go.
Or even if you're not doing that, take the opportunity to leave the resort property and go and actually experience the place around you. I'm not going to talk about cruises today. I just won't.
Okay. I do believe we have some online questions. Okay. This comes from Tom. Carbon offsets were mentioned by the panel. Do we know if it is a widespread practice? How does it work? Is it expensive? And is it something that travelers should do? I'm going to assume, Stuart, that you probably have some background in that.
Yeah. So first off, carbon offsets, just to kind of give a definition of what this is. It's basically paying an additional fee that ultimately results in some thing happening that is designed to reduce carbon, as opposed to the thing that you're doing, which is going to generate carbon. And so that's the rough description of it. It's certainly better than nothing. I'll say that. It is better than not doing anything. The problem is, well, there's a bunch of problems, but the biggest problem is you are taking a definite creation of carbon emissions and paying for an indefinite generation of carbon reduction. Is the thing that's being done, would that have happened anyway? Are you paying to plant trees that would have been planted anyway? If the thing that indirectly is being done, if it does come to its total fruition, we really don't know if that amount is going to offset what your flight or your trip actually ever was. So it's better than nothing, because it does create this demand. It creates money that can be spent on things that should be designed to reduce carbon, and that's good. If you are going to do it, my personal recommendation would be to look for something that follows what's called the gold standard. And gold standard is not, we think about, oh, it's the gold standard like a marketing phrase. There's actually a thing called gold standard that is kind of the good housekeeping seal of carbon credits. And what they do is they make sure that the thing that's happening wouldn't have happened otherwise. Okay. So it's a net additional thing. And I think that in and of itself is good, because the question of whether or not there's going to be enough carbon removed to actually offset the carbon that you've generated, that's a scientific question that most people aren't going to be able to know in our lifetimes. Mm-hmm. But I sure feel better about knowing that something that wouldn't have happened anyway has a better shot of happening because there's this pool of money that's coming that might be able to afford it.
And we come all the way back to where Emily started us too, which is clearly what you're encouraging is that idea of doing your homework, like of knowing where it's going. It's intriguing. Do we have other questions?
Did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you.
My name is Sarah, and I'm a senior fellow here at Massey. And I'm myself, I found myself preparing to start traveling again and going through all these questions. I travel a lot for work, research, and conferences, and wondering if I need to go back to those thousands of miles again. And just to continue on this theme of the carbon footprint, I'm wondering if there's like a resource that you can send us to, whether online or book, that would help us weigh these decisions, if there's one good place to go to get this information. And thank you, this has been a wonderful panel.
Great.
I would, you maybe do.
Yeah, no, so Gold Standard is a thing. So go there and learn more. It's an actual website. Okay. And so go there and learn more. The question is the right one, but as I've been trying to say, it's actually not the only one, right? So the idea of offsetting the carbon emissions of a flight is something that is very much front and center right now, as well it should be. And the aircraft manufacturers are working on battery-operated planes. They are working on other fuel sources. There are things happening at the system level that are already improving. Like I'll come back to the question, but just on the carbon offset thing, COVID has obviously been awful, just terrible in many, 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 many ways. There is one small silver lining in aviation that has come out of as a result of COVID. And a lot of people don't realize this. When COVID struck, airlines around the world grounded thousands and thousands of aircraft. In fact, there are still many aircraft that have not returned to the skies. Some areas are still, the borders are still closed, or they're just returning now. But what happened with the grounding of these aircraft is that many airlines around the world chose to permanently ground their least efficient aircraft. And so the aircraft that were real fuel pigs, that were both expensive, inefficient, and the least environmentally responsible aircraft, many of them have been like taken out. And so, and not just kind of parked somewhere, but for instance, American Airlines in the US, they got rid of some aircraft, complete types of aircraft. And getting rid of an aircraft type is a meaningful step, because it means they're getting rid of their spare parts. The people that know how to fly those things and operate them and maintain them, they were among those who were exited. Like, those planes are not coming back. And so as we return to travel, and as travel starts back up again, there are fewer aircraft in the sky than there were before. The aircraft that are in the sky are more environmentally responsible than the ones that were there before, because a lot of the other ones are just plain gone. So some of the stresses and strains we've seen in global aviation over the course of the past 18 months has been a result of the fact that there are fewer planes in the sky, there are fewer seats available as things start to return, but the planes that are flying, on the whole, are much more environmentally responsible, much more efficient, much lower emissions, lower carbon on a per passenger basis, more modern technology, as opposed to like 20, 25-year-old aircraft that could have been put out to pasture many, many years ago. They took this opportunity to simply cease flying those. So this is some of the systemic thing that I'm talking about, right? So to your point, if you're going to a conference right now, odds are the aircraft that you're going to fly to get there is better for the environment than the one that you would have gone on in 2019, on average, just by virtue of the aircraft that are still flying.
That's neat. I'm gonna ask, if you don't mind, you a question, because you're exactly, when you described your beginning to think about returning to travel, that's exactly where we started this whole conversation. And you mentioned the carbon. What other factors are in your mind as you think about returning to travel? Do you have the microphone? I think sorry.
Yeah. Maybe my position is a little special. I'm a curator at a museum, and I oversee a global collection. So it's always been my practice to be going out to doing the research, but I think with other events, social events that have taken place during COVID, it's now more a matter of bringing people here from these source countries and actually having them come and study the collections and do the research. So that's been, I think, a shift, in my own ethics, but that's within my own discipline about who should be doing the traveling and who should be doing the research around these objects. But that's maybe a very specific museum one. But I wanted to thank you too about thinking, in terms of my travel and carbon footprint. I was only thinking about that, but yeah, I travel to see family all the time, and I never put that into the bin of the carbon footprint. I just think, oh, well, it's family, so. But I realize now that they're all tied up. So, did that answer some of your question? Or?
Yeah, it does. In fact, actually, you raised something that we haven't talked about. I don't know that we intended to or not. But when you speak about it from your work perspective, you talk about it from a business perspective, that has had a huge change in terms of travel. The decisions that businesses are making about travel, the learning from being online, and it's a very significant piece. And Emily, I don't know in your work whether there has been much travel. Has there been in your work that have people tended to travel for their work?
Definitely a lot less since COVID, because as I work in New York law in Toronto, so pre-COVID we would travel quite a bit to New York, or we would travel to clients' office in like in Alberta or BC, because a lot of our clients are mining companies, and we do due diligence on their files. But luckily now, because of COVID, everything can be done from my bedroom, and I think that's it's kind of great in a sense, in that like these like small meetings where like really nothing is happening. There's no like human interaction really. People are sitting in an empty room with boxes basically. That kind of travel that has been eliminated, and the only travel that happens in our job now are the big ones where that human connection actually matters. And I think that's probably going to be the same for conferences and stuff, is that a lot of people talk about how environmentally destructive conferences are, but you can't replace Zoom meetings. You can't replace human interaction with Zoom meetings. That just doesn't work. But there is definitely a shift. And I know a lot of my friends in consulting right now, they don't really travel as much for work, because normally they were on the road for 250 days a year. Wow. Now almost all of that travel is canceled.
Yeah. And Stuart, of course, you began there telling us that about your own experience in terms of,
Yeah, and I mean, this is from an ethics, environmental impact perspective, this is meaningful. From an industry and economic perspective, this is also a huge, huge question that hangs over the future of the travel industry, because those 40 or 50 seats at the front of the plane, they cover a lot of the cost of the entire plane, and so you might think, oh well, I'm going to London, I'm going to spend $1,000. There are people up front that spend $10,000. And you might think, who the hell's going to pay $10,000? Well, a lot of people do, and that $10,000 covers a multitude of sins within the industry in terms of creating revenue that is then spent in other ways. Yeah. And so the same thing happens when you look at destinations, hotels, downtown hotels, large conferences. Do we go back to the days of 150,000 person conferences? We might not think about that again. We talk about travel. Every single day there are conferences with hundreds of thousands of people coming from multiple parts of the world, arriving in different places. If only 50,000 of them now travel, then that's potentially better for the environment. But what about the people that work in that world that then don't have those people coming anymore? What about the people who work in the catering kitchens? What about the people that do the audiovisual? So there's still a lot as we come out of COVID. I think that the early emergence has been, I'm going to go visit grandma, come hell or high water, I'm going back to the old country, I'm going, right? Or I'm going on vacation, I deserve it, it's been too long, I'm going. The next thing that's still unclear is how often are business travelers going to stay on Zoom versus getting on a plane to go somewhere, both for the good and the bad of that.
Thank you. So in answer to your question, was that helpful? Yes. Thank you, because that's an area that you brought us into. So I thank you very, very much. Any other observation? Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hi.
Please.
So I've thought about a lot of things while you've been talking. I consider myself a traveler. I've traveled to some of the places some of you have been to and some of the places I need to get to. But there was one thing you mentioned, Emily, which was traveling local when you can. And I think especially in the pandemic, people have really seized on that, with fear of traveling in, like, not even the plane, just the airport itself, and all kinds of different considerations. And one of the things that we've seen is like a proliferation of Airbnb, which has its own sort of ethical conundrums and quandaries, which maybe you have some comments on. And also we see, like, through Airbnb and through local travel, let's say specifically, we can see in Prince Edward County, a huge shift in whether or not it's even affordable for people to live there anymore. People who used to live there because that was where they chose to live, and they could live there because they didn't have high incomes. They could live places, for a year, and then because of Airbnb, people are like, I'm no longer going to rent my home for the year. I'm going to actually just rent it week to week or whatever, and that's better for me. And they kick people out. So I'm curious, your thoughts on sort of taking all of these things into consideration and what that means for, like, the ethics of travel for, let's say somebody from Toronto.
I'm going to respond to your point, because I think traveling locally is a very interesting concept. And Tom Axworthy and I, who have been organizing these, back in September, Tom and his wife Roberta and my wife Brenda, we've been talking for the longest time about wanting to spend a few days in southwestern Ontario and look at sort of the routes of the Underground Railroad. And so we did it. We spent 3 days local. I mean, it's a 2-hour drive. We also had time to go to see the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame, which was kind of fun too. But not only was it a great travel experience, but we learned so much about that experience. And so that's an interesting concept about, how much there is to be offered locally, and so I appreciate that. I don't know if anybody has any quick comment about that. We're drawing to a close. Anybody?
So Airbnb, or vacation rentals by owner, is a big topic in and of itself. Yeah. I think that it can be a force for good, in that it enables some people to have another source of revenue. It enables people to meet people from other places, and it can be a more affordable and lighter way to travel. The flip side is it's increasingly just a commercial thing, not just that people have things that they then might have rented out but are now doing by the day, but Airbnb now owns a hotel in New York, and there are companies who have bought multiple buildings and they just sell them via these platforms or directly or via other platforms. So it's very complex and probably a little too difficult to get into right now. I think that, like anything, there's some good there, and looking to take advantage of it in a way that's good as a user, I think, like everything, is important. There's a flip side, which is, in many ways, it's actually just a hotel that's selling a room that way.
Yeah. We're just about done, and so Emily, I'm just going to, Stuart's just shared some stuff. I'm going to give you the last word. Any kind of last thought that you might want to share with us?
Well, now that COVID is basically over, I would just say go travel and go see the world. And, I think about the decisions that you make while you're traveling, but definitely just get out there.
Where are you going next?
I don't know. For the first time in my life, I don't know. I really wanted to go to Mongolia, but the flights there right now are difficult.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, Stuart and Emily, I want to thank you both for your time today, and for those who are here and those who are online, we thank you, and it's been a really interesting kind of conversation, and so thank you very much. Thank you.